In his section on alienated labor in the 1844 manuscript, Marx seems to give 4 descriptions of humans being alienated under capitalism. When people talk about alienation in Marx, what is often referred to are the first and second. 1, the factory worker being alienated from the product which she produces in her factory work, and 2, her being alienated from the work she does while on her factory shift. In my lecture today, I will start with presenting the first 2 and show a problem that may arise if one tries to understand them standing alone. Afterwards, I want to point to the often overlooked 3, the workers being alienated from being a Gattungswesen, and 4, her being alienated from the other humans. The word Gattungswesen is often translated into species being, even though genus being might be more accurate given the Feuerbach-Hegel background. I will use Gattung and Gattungswesen today and will just not translate it. What I want to say today is that alienation describes a relation between humans gone wrong. Being alienated from an object and being alienated from your own activity means nothing else than being alienated from the other humans. And that means relating to the other in a bad way. Finally, I want to show that Marx's term of alienation implicitly shows that seeking the good means seeking the good of humans as Gattungswesen, as humans living together. I aim to show that alienation is not only a tool to criticize the living conditions in capitalism, but a way into a reflection on the good. As a start, I will recall Marx's first and second descriptions of alienation from the 1844 manuscripts. Before doing so, it is worth noticing that Marx's use of the term labor, in German Arbeit, is not exclusive to wage labor under capitalism. I read Marx's term labor as the human form of being productive, producing a product in a broad sense. One can build a chair, producing the chair, making the object, or one can make a part of a forest into the resource wood by building a fence around it. Marx speaks of Vergegenständlichung, which translates to objectification. So the act of labor is an act of objectification. That means roughly that the way humans act in and on the world is a way of making the world their object. The alienated form of labor under capitalism still falls under this definition. Although, under capitalism, the workers doing her labor is an act of objectification in an alienated way. The product, the objectification of her labor, is not her product. The objectification of the labor is the realization, in German Verwirklichung, of labor, but with capitalist labor, the worker doesn't realize herself. She derealizes herself, entwirklicht in German. Producing the product means alienating herself. The product of her work is alien to her. It is not only not herself that she produces, it is not only external. Marx says the product confronts her with hostility. So the first description of alienation that Marx gives us is the alienated relation between the worker and the product her labor has produced. The second description looks at the act of laboring itself. Marx says that the act of production that produces something that is external to the producer has to be an act of exposure. An act of exposure is described further as a kind of labor by which the worker is not affirming herself, but negating herself. Other images in this part of the manuscript he uses are not feeling at home while working, not feeling well, the act of labor not belonging to her being, not having free energy, or a sentence with which a lot of working people can identify: if she doesn't have to do it, she immediately stops. In short, it is forced labor. Not only does the product of labor under capitalism not belong to the worker, the act of labor itself, the use of labor power, does also not belong to the worker. It belongs to someone else. In Alienation 1, the product is alienated. Marx says that this makes the worker alienated from the outside world, alienated from the object. In Alienation 2, the activity is alienated. Marx says that human living is nothing else than activity. Human lives are those humans' activities, and so the human engaged in an alienated activity is alienated from herself, alienated from the subject. At this point, it is unclear how to understand this, how to understand the distinctions Marx introduces. In my opinion, one is not able to understand these distinctions and following from them the two descriptions of alienation that I just explained without understanding 3 and 4. If one nevertheless tries to understand 1 and 2 standing alone and tries to find a solution to the social problem of alienation, then there is a possibility of thinking of a false solution to it. If one understands alienation to be, in essence, the distorted relation between a worker and their product, or between a worker and the act of producing, then one might suggest that to get rid of alienation, these relationships need to be altered. In the alienated state, the product is not the worker's product, and so it would be a logical step to suggest that the product should instead be made the worker's own. Or that when the worker leaves the factory and starts their own little business, on Etsy for example, producing their own products, then the laboring would no longer be forced. The worker would neither be alienated from the outside world nor from herself. This solution at best appears to be one, though. Sadly, if the worker gets rid of their boss by becoming their own boss, then the products might be hers to sell, but their laboring is still alienated, so is the product which they produce. The labor is still forced. Forced labor is further described by Marx as the labor that is not satisfying a need, but it is a means to be able to satisfying a need that lies outside of it. The labor thereby is forced by something outside of it. In the classless society, labor itself would become humans' first need, and being a need itself, laboring thereby would be satisfying a need directly. But the worker who has to produce one product in order to sell it, to be able to buy the things that satisfy her needs, is still living an alienated life. And even if a self-employed worker can decide whether to work in the morning or at night, then the labor is still not free, even if in a more indirect way the labor is still for sale. To shed more light on this, I will now turn to the descriptions 3 and 4 of alienation in the 1844 manuscripts. As I said in the beginning, Marx formulates alienation in version 3 as the human being alienated from their Gattungswesen. So what does Gattungswesen mean? I will read out a sentence from the Paris manuscripts that I think contains all one needs to know about Gattungswesen. You will find the quotation in the German original and an English translation on the handout, and I will read out the English one. The human is a Gattungswesen, not only and practically and theoretically making the Gattung, both his own and that of the other things, his object, but, and this is simply another expression of the same thing, but also in that he relates to himself as a present living Gattung by relating to himself as a universal and thereby free being. I read Gattungswesen as the practical, self-conscious life of humans. Humans, Marx says, make themselves their own Gattungswesen and the life form of all the other things to their object. They are conscious and self-conscious. Being self-conscious is relating to oneself as a present living Gattung. That Marx points out that the Gattung is present and living shows that he doesn't intend Gattungswesen in an essentialist way. The Gattung of humans is different from that of animals. It is a different form of nature. Its form is a relation. Humans relate self-consciously to each other. The form of their Gattung is them and their mutual relating. That is what Marx means when he says humans are universal, act universally, and are thereby free. The universality is the relation to themselves and the world that is made possible by their being self-conscious. Being universal means being able to make everything your object. It is very important that Gattungswesen doesn't describe the being of a particular human as a particular human. It is the being of the human. So not all particular humans have a Gattungswesen, a nature, and together they are Gattungswesen plural. Gattungswesen is singular, it is a form. Humans don't particularly make the world and themselves their object, they do it together. They form the present living Gattung. And thereby, every particular is formed by the present living Gattung, but also every particular human is forming the present living Gattung itself. So in sharing the form Gattungswesen, which is a form of relation, a relation that means making oneself and the world their object, not alone, but through each other, humans and beings Gattungswesen relate to each other. The relation is the relation of living through each other. I will try to make this clearer by quoting a different short passage, only a page further than the one quoted before. In this passage, Marx writes about the alienated Gattungswesen. You also find this on the handout. So, quote, alienated labor not only, 1, alienates nature from the human, and 2, alienates the human from himself, from his own acting function, from his activity of life. Because of this, it also alienates the human from the Gattung. It converts the Gattung's life into a means for his individual life. Firstly, it alienates Gattung's life and individual life, and secondly, it converts the latter in its abstraction into the end of the former, also in its abstract and alienated form. For the first place, labor, activity of life, productive life itself, appears to the human only as a means for the satisfaction of a need, the need to sustain physical existence. But productive life is Gattungslife. It is life creating life. The whole character of a Gattung, its Gattung's character, lies in the kind of its activity of life. And free conscious activity constitutes the Gattung's character of the human. Life itself appears only as a means of life. So, being alienated from the Gattung means that one is not the Gattungswesen in being the individual one, and the individual one in being the Gattungswesen. When she is alienated, the individual one splits being individual from being a Gattung. And as Marx says, in a second step, she makes the Gattung, the living with others, relating to others, into a means of being the individual. Life itself, which is the Gattung, as he says, appears only as a means of life. Unalienated life, living as a Gattungswesen, would mean to live life creating the life of the Gattung. That can easily be misunderstood as if in the unalienated form it would be the other way around, that the individual life would be the means for the Gattungslife. But that is not the case. In unalienated form, the Gattungslife and the individual life are not alienated from each other, they fall together. The Gattungslife is the form of the individual life, and this form is a relation. That is why the fourth way of defining alienation in the manuscript reads, the worker being alienated from the other human. I hope that it is clear that 4 is only another way of saying 3. Being alienated from the Gattungswesen is being alienated from the other human. Our form is a relation to each other. Being alienated from that form, thereby, is being alienated from each other. Now, I want to go back to 1 and 2. I want to show how 1 and 2 are also a manifestation of the bad relation between humans. I said that, according 1, that the relation between worker and her product is alienated. Her product is not hers, it is somebody else's. But the solution is not that the product should become hers. The relation between the person owning the product, in this case the factory owner, and the worker producing the product is the problem. The problem is not that it is not hers, the problem is that it is somebody else's. Private property is a relation between people, not a relation between people and things. So being alienated from the other is what brings about the situation in which workers are alienated from their products. Private property is the alienation from each other. In the alienated relation to each other, my needs are my needs, and your needs are your needs. And if I want to satisfy my needs, I might instrumentally satisfy your needs so that you satisfy mine. You need a worker, I need the money to buy food and pay my rent. So I sell the use of my labor capacity to you and thereby alienate my labor from my needs. I am not active because I want to be active. I am active because I want to be able to eat. That my labor is alienated from me is not a problem that I can solve by working on my relationship to my laboring. My labor and I are alienated because I have to sell the use of my laboring capacity to you, because I am alienated from you. My end is my individual life, my individual survival. Your end is your individual life, your individual profit. A solution to alienation as a social problem lies therefore in our relation to each other. In the unalienated state, humans live through each other. My good cannot be distinct from your good. If it is distinct, we are alienated from each other and thereby not living a truly human life. Finally, I want to say something about the idea of good, which I find to be implicit in the conception of alienation that I just presented. If my good and your good cannot be distinct from each other in the way described before, then how do we understand the idea of good for us to not live an alienated life? The idea of good is not something that lies outside of humans and something which they try to reach. I think the good is the human Gattungswesen that has properly actualized itself. This is people meeting each other's need. The activity of togetherness is the good. The act of relating is the good. The idea of good is the full actualization of the relation between you and me, that is Gattungswesen. Following Marx, I think that being a self-conscious living being means to know ourselves in a practical way. And knowing ourselves means knowing what is good for us. Humans live together, but I understand this togetherness not only in the way that we cooperate to solve our own good with each other's help. I think we live through each other and we know ourselves and our needs through each other. As an ending to my presentation today and as a short outlook, I will present a small passage from another early writing of Marx. In this text, he presents how human needs can be imagined when they are not alienated. This might give a glimpse of the direction in which I think a further investigation into human needs and the idea of good should go. The passage is from the excerpts on James Mill. I will read out the translation. You find it on the handout. The German original is also on the handout in case you prefer to read this. So, it's a quotation that I think is very awesome. So it's quite long, but nevertheless, I will read it. Let's say that we had produced as human beings. Each of us would have doubly affirmed themselves and the other in their production. 1. In my production, I would have objectified the peculiarity of my individuality, and therefore, I would have both enjoyed an individual expression of life in doing so, as well I, while looking at the object, would have known my personality as an objective and sensuously perceptible force, beyond all doubt. 2. In your consumption or use of my product, I would immediately have the enjoyment, both in my knowing of that I satisfied a human need with my work. That means that I had objectified the human nature and thus had made a fitting object for a need of another human being. 3. I would have been for you the mediator between you and the Gattung, so would have been known and experienced by you as an addition to your own being and as a necessary part of yourself. Thus, I would know myself to be confirmed both in your thoughts and your love. 4. As well as I would have the enjoyment in knowing that I have immediately created your expression of life with my individual expression of life, that is, in my individual activity, I immediately confirmed and realized my true nature, my human communal being. Our productions would be as many mirrors from which our being would shine towards each other. The relation thereby becomes mutual. From your side be done what is done from mine. So, if my need is internal to yours and yours to mine, labor is no longer forced. Because then it is not instrumental anymore, it is a need itself. I think we should try to understand human nature in such a social and interdependent way. In a further investigation into human needs and the idea of good, this should be brought into focus. Thank you for your attention.